Josh, I want to start with you. You just heard my interview with Christina Oxenberg. She talks about the other men, the powerful men who may be outed in all of this. But one thing she told me that wasn't included in that clip is she said she believes that those men, for the most part, may have had sex with girls who were not underage, girls who may have been 19 or 20 years old. If they were right over the legal limit, will that protect them moving forward?
No, not necessarily, because there's a variety of other laws that actually criminalize moving people across state lines and around the country for immoral and indecent purposes. It goes back as far as the Mann Act in 1910 in the United States, which was originally titled the Anti-White Slave Act, but has now been expanded to pretty much cover anyone that is moving a woman across state lines, and the U.S. Virgin Islands would fall into that jurisdiction for immoral or indecent purposes. And it's a great catch-all law. Juries respond to it really well. The Department of Justice uses it extensively, and it absolutely would apply to people being involved in an organization involving bringing these women to a private island to have sex with them, regardless of their age.
That may explain why many of these men might be nervous tonight. Hillary, I want to ask you, you heard Christina Oxenberg suggest, and this really blew my mind, that there is a deal in the background, she believes, with powerful people who have told Ghislaine if she stays quiet, they will get her out of the United States, get her transferred back to the UK, where she'll be in some kind of luxury prison there and eventually get out. Do you think that's really possible, Hillary?
Well, Brian, right now, of course, that's speculation, but anything is possible. And it begs the question for anybody, why has she remained quiet? She has not divulged any specifics or any details. And yes, she does have those tapes. We know that. I think what's very interesting, though, to consider is that Lady Victoria Hervey, she is a former girlfriend of Prince Andrew. She has been on air claiming Prince Andrew's absolute innocence and saying that the photographer who took the photograph, the now infamous photograph of Prince Andrew with Virginia Giuffre in that apartment building with, you're showing it now with Ghislaine Maxwell in the background, that was a very badly photoshopped photograph. Of course, Prince Andrew couldn't come out and defend himself. So the question also becomes, why on earth did Prince Andrew settle for those nearly $12 million with Virginia Giuffre? Of course, in a jubilee, of course, for his mother. Again, speculation, but yes, you're absolutely right. There are very many powerful men, powerful and rich beyond any comprehension, that absolutely don't want anything out there, and they can pull all sorts of international strings.
Josh, Christina was very clear with me. She thinks if she had already started talking, if Ghislaine had spoken and given the names, that she would be dead by now. She thinks the only reason Ghislaine is alive is because she's stayed quiet. What do you think about that, Josh?
It's absolutely reasonable. We're not talking about normal people. When you get to the levels of power and influence, the whole world changes when you get up in this stratospheric level. And that's why everything still is on the table. Would anybody else be considered for an international, basically prisoner exchange with one of our favorite international allies, the UK? No, not in a million years, but it's absolutely possible for some of her support team to set this up as basically a political prosecution, especially consider the people involved. And that is exactly how governments get together, make some sausage in the back room, split Solomon's baby, and people get freed, moved, changed. Situations are always amenable if there's enough political will and power behind the movement. That's the real question. We all have strong suspicions and knowledge about the Epstein 8. There's also additional people that I believe are undisclosed. She holds, that being Ghislaine, immense power to affect her current sentence of 20 years by offering to share or use that information. And she could be biding her time until this theoretical promise of transfer materializes. But as soon as she gives up those names, she gives up her power, and then she's no good to anyone. So she has one more big shot. She's going to make the most of it.
Handling of the Jeffrey Epstein case continues to dominate headlines. The Justice Department has petitioned a federal judge to release grand jury transcripts in the case. I sat down with Harvard Law Professor Emeritus Alan Dershowitz, who once represented Epstein, to get his take on what evidence there actually is and how much of it he thinks we'll ever get to see.
Professor, good to have you with us because you've got a bit of an insider look at some of this. Let's separate fact from fiction. You say there was never a client list per se, but there are other names. There's other information. Are they in the grand jury transcripts? And do you think a judge releases that?
I think the judge should release it, but they're not in the grand jury transcripts. They're sealed records by 2 or 3 federal judges in the New York courts. I've seen some of these materials. For example, there is an FBI report of interviews with alleged victims in which at least one of the victims names very important people, and the names have been redacted. I know some of the names from my investigation. For example, George Mitchell, the former senator, Bill Richardson, the former ambassador to the UN, Ehud Barak, the granddaughter of Jacques Cousteau, were all accused. Now, whether any of these people actually did anything wrong, we don't know, because we know there have been many, many false accusations. For example, a woman named Sarah Ransom filed an affidavit, and it's probably in the record, and it's probably been sealed, in which she accused Bill Clinton, Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump, Richard Branson of having sex with young people, and she said she had videotapes of this. And then after an investigation, she admitted she made up the whole story, and yet the affidavit still remains in the court record. So we have to be very careful to distinguish true accusation from false accusations, and I suspect the courts will be sensitive to that. They will not want to just produce the names of people who have been falsely accused without also producing information about the people who have falsely accused them. So this is a complex matter.
Yeah, like you said, all of those names out there could be completely innocent of anything, but it's possible that they were mentioned somewhere along the line. So just to be clear, what they've asked for, the Trump administration, those grand jury transcripts, they're separate from other information that you say is sealed. Would that have to be a separate request from someone else in order to get that information you reference?
Yes, definitely. And the information that hasn't been requested is going to be far more informative and far more relevant than the grand jury information. Grand jury information is narrowly tailored by prosecutors only to provide sufficient evidence to result in an indictment. They don't want to put a lot of material in the grand jury because that would then introduced to the defendant. So what's much, much more important is discovery information, depositions, and other kinds of things that came out of the Ghislaine Maxwell case, that came out of other cases that were pending in front of federal judges. And for example, the case involving Prince Andrew, all of that should be revealed as well. And as long as there's nothing redacted about the accuser's lack of credibility, then the public has the right to make its own decision. Just because somebody's name is mentioned doesn't really mean very much.
Yeah, absolutely. That's always a good caution. You mentioned Ghislaine Maxwell. She's still got an appeal I'm tracking at the Supreme Court. But in the meantime, you suggest she should be potentially offered congressional immunity to go and testify. Do you think that would happen? And what kind of information would she have that we haven't seen?
She knows everything. She is the Rosetta Stone. She knows everything. She arranged every single trip with everybody. She knows everything. And if she were just given use immunity, she could be compelled to testify. I'm told that she actually would be willing to testify, and there'd be no reason for her to withhold any information. So I don't see any negative in giving her the kind of use immunity that would compel her to testify. So she ought to be summoned in front of a congressional committee.
Well, we'll continue to track her case. Professor, thank you for weighing in and giving us a little
Tesla and wasn't necessarily accused of wrongdoing, but was subpoenaed because he was suspected of having had some sort of involvement with Epstein and JP as it related to Epstein. And that case got settled out of court, so it didn't go to trial. But JP Morgan as it related to Epstein, and other residences were not rated, like the Zorro Ranch property in New Mexico, never rated. And then why, it took them a month to get to the island in the U.S. Virgin Islands, Little St. James. Be nice to know that. And of course, some of arguably some very important documents I believe could be obtained by the Department of Justice that are held not by the FBI, but the U.S. Virgin Islands, because there was this case involving the U.S. Virgin Islands and JP Morgan as it related to Epstein. And that case got settled out of court, so it didn't go to trial. But I believe those documents would be very, very, very telling. But I would argue the reason they won't come out is because one of the people subpoenaed as part of that investigation was Elon Musk.
Oh, wow.
He wasn't necessarily accused of wrongdoing, but was subpoenaed because he was suspected of having had some sort of involvement with Epstein and JP Morgan. And there are allegations, of course, not really allegations, but, it was reported, before Musk was closely affiliated with Trump that Epstein had been advising Tesla and was part of this effort in 2018 to take Tesla private. With Gulf oil money or Saudi money. And at the time, Epstein was advising Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince of Saudi Arabia, and was also known to have a close relationship with the elite families of the United Arab Emirates, and also Kuwait, and I think Bahrain as well. So perhaps they don't want to have that really be explored at this point. But some of the other figures that were subpoenaed and accused of wrongdoing, because in the case of the USVI case, it was specifically that JP Morgan's accounts with Epstein and relationship with Epstein was connected to the human trafficking, sex trafficking. And so you have people like Larry Page and Sergey Brin of Google, the Google co-founders, being subpoenaed as part of that. You have Tom Pritzker of Hyatt Hotels being subpoenaed. And of course, the Pritzkers are a very powerful family in Chicago, specifically very connected, for example, to the rise of Barack Obama as a politician, but also a lot of prominent think tanks like the Carnegie Endowment run by a Pritzker. And I think Tom Pritzker, who was subpoenaed here, ran for a long time or was chairman of the board of CSIS, which is one of these very national security adjacent think tanks with a lot of influence on U.S. national security policy. So probably people that can afford to be sort of left out of the limelight, I guess, because a lot of, what I've argued for a long time as it relates to Epstein is that, there's been a pretty much exclusive focus on his sex crimes, but not his financial crimes. Epstein was a guy that, obviously the media narrative since his arrest and his death has tried to frame him as a great Gatsby kind of figure. He was all talk and just a charlatan and this and that. No, he was kept around by elite figures because he was very good at helping them evade taxes and was very good at money laundering and had a very, very intimate knowledge of the offshore banking system, where a lot of these families historically hide their money. So like the Pritzker family, for example, have early ties to organized crime going back to like the 20s and 30s. And they were one of the main clients early on of Castle Bank, which brings together some organized crime linked figures. And also the CIA through Paul Hellawell, who was a CIA banker that helped set it up. And, it helped launder money for organized crime interests and also some of these families like the Pritzkers who later became very politically powerful. So,
and of course, the governor, J.B. Pritzker.
Yeah, sure. And Penny Pritzker was Obama's Secretary of Commerce. Right. And the Pritzkers and the Crowns, who, Lester Crown was part of the mega group that we talked about earlier. And the Crown family, going back to Henry Crown, have extensive organized crime ties as well. They sort of helped Barack Obama's early career, for example, and sort of helped propel him to the presidency, and first as a senator, right? But sort of, have a lot of influence on Democratic politics in Chicago in particular. So it's really not surprising that you'd have a Pritzker be governor there. But they're quite a powerful and influential family. It doesn't really get talked about a lot. And speaking of the Crowns, on the board of JP Morgan for a long time was James Crown, Lester Crown's son, who, along with banking interests in Ohio, intimately tied to Leslie Wexner, basically had created modern-day J.P. Morgan with Jamie Dimon at the helm. They're totally responsible for Jamie Dimon being in charge of that bank, namely Crown, and also this guy named John Kessler, who is just as much a Leslie Wexner henchman as Epstein was, and was intimately involved with Epstein as well. So, those are the people that put Jamie Dimon in charge. Arguably, that explains why why Epstein and J.P. Morgan had such a close relationship. And I think they just couldn't have that case go to court. So Pam Bondi could get a lot of that information if she wanted to, but I don't think there's any interest in exploring that.
What about Megyn Kelly? You said that she was. Are you saying that she was downplaying it, or are you saying she was just reporting on?
Yeah, well, I don't regularly watch her show. I want to make that very clear, full disclosure. But I was shown a clip that had been posted on Twitter of her subsequently after the first release, saying that it was her understanding that the documents that were allegedly being sifted through after the phase 1 release were not really as significant as some had been led to believe. There's also this claim that gets circulated a lot that there's like a client list the FBI is sitting on, and it's really doubtful as to whether or not that actually exists or not. So, the idea of the client list is like, who did Epstein film and who is compromised? Will that come out? And, we pretty much can look at a few names of who were likely the people that were compromised, but I don't think that's any substitute for going after the people who sponsored the compromising, right? Because obviously they're the ones trying to control the people who were compromised for their benefit. So you should absolutely look at that. And so, I think this is just kind of an effort to, make it appear like there's transparency when there really isn't as much transparency as people are being led to believe. And also, transparency in this case is no substitute for investigating and prosecuting people who absolutely should be targeted, like Leslie Wexner. Right. And his, business empire that Epstein helped build, Epstein's relationship with Bear Stearns, which arguably helped set off the 2008 financial crisis, absolutely should be scrutinized. It has not. His relationship with J.P. Morgan and Deutsche Bank, obviously the J.P. Morgan one was covered up because they settled out of court and kept all the information from coming out in court. And then also there's the case of, Epstein and the Deutsche Bank case, where, one of the judge overseeing it, her son was murdered as she was about to start overseeing that case. And then no one reports on it, and then it settles out of court as well. Obviously, I think there is some stuff there with the money flows that is a big problem for both parties. And so even though you think it would be politically expedient, for the Trump administration, to report on, Tom Pritzker or something like that, since his family's so tied to like the Obama network or whatever, it's not going to happen, because you pull on some of that and it just airs out too much dirty laundry of the whole system that it absolutely involves both parties. And also, there's the case too that the Trump administration could have put out information related to Epstein's White House visits during the Clinton administration, which you think, again, would be politically expedient for the Trump administration, but there's no way they'll touch that. Because as I mentioned earlier, it's related to this, there was arms trafficking and all sorts of other crazy things going on with, a lot of people that had previously been involved in the Iran-Contra network. And, Trump world has ties to that. So I don't think they'd be interested in having that come out. But it would be very nice if they did. But there's plenty of aspects of the Epstein case that could easily be obtained by Pam Bondi and released, and they won't be. So.
And I think that there's a sense of like a clear story of a group of elite people that are getting away with the worst crimes that could have ever been done, and that there's a cover up. And if Trump's participating in that cover up, it's bad for his brand. That's my contention.
Yeah, I think that's and
last year, the Biden administration allowed our investigators to look at portions of the file.
Yesterday.
Last year, the Biden administration allowed our investigators to look at portions of the file. We did that at the Treasury building. Here is what it says. Treasury's Epstein file details, Mr. President, 4,725 wire transfers. Let me repeat that. 4,725 wire transfers, adding up to nearly $1.1 billion flowing in and out of just one of Mr. Epstein's bank accounts. If you ask me, that is more than 4,000 potential lines of investigation right there. Hundreds of millions more flowed through other accounts. That's even a lot more to investigate. The file shows that Mr. Epstein used multiple Russian banks, which are now under sanctions, to process payments related to sex trafficking.
I imagine those banks were also used for a lot of other things too. It really does raise questions. I think, but just my experience is always just sort of like, they are usually hiding something other than what people think it is in these situations. And that the exposure is to other things that we're not supposed to see. And Besant has apparently been stonewalling a lot of these questions for a while about the finances. And who knows where the next sort of like break in the dam is going to be.
It's interesting that Wyden is the guy doing this because his father, Peter Wyden, was a journalist with really good sources. He wrote one of the first good exposés on the CIA's involvement with the Bay of Pigs planning and fiasco. So if there's somebody who has sources on the Democratic side of the aisle, it would be, I think, Wyden.
And things like, some of the Times writes here, some of the Epstein money transfers disclosed in the report from JP Morgan Chase involved accounts at 2 Russian banks before those institutions were subjected to U.S. sanctions. A few transactions red flag were for as much as $100 million. And it's interesting that Wyden would be on that given his background because of, the claims about intelligence and things like that. But we still don't even know how Epstein made his fortune. He went from high school teacher to a guy that was responsible for basically billions of dollars in transactions, and he was managing the money for one particular person for around 20 to 30 years.
An enigma.